Everyone, this is Mahalea Marshall with the IQ Consortium Secretariat. I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning for the IQ webinar on CMC considerations for pediatric drug development. This presentation is presented by the IQ Drug Product Leadership Group's Pediatric Working Group, and this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available on the IQ website. Before we begin, I would like to just go through a few housekeeping items. First, the webinar will be an hour in duration. At most, we should end around 12 p.m. Secondly, you will see a panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can click the orange arrow to collapse the control panel. Next, if you're connecting over the internet, participants can avoid audio feedback by using a headset or keeping wireless devices away from their computers. For those calling in by telephone, please enter the audio PIN number shown here so that if we encounter any feedback, we can mute your line. Finally, a Q&A session will take place at the end of the presentation. Questions may be entered into the box highlighted here during the course of the presentation. And finally, this webinar is subject to the antitrust guidelines adopted by the IQ Consortium Board of Directors. These guidelines require us to steer clear from any discussion of any commercially sensitive topics such as pricing or market shares. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to our presenter, Eleni Doku.
Thank you very much, Mahalea. I hope everyone can see the screen now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Would you like me to introduce the lady? This is.
Sure. Thanks, Beth.
Sorry. Okay. Hi, this is Beth Galella, co-leader of the Pediatric Working Group. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Eleni Doku. Eleni has a diploma in chemical engineering from the Aristotle University in Greece and a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Delaware. She's worked for Merck & Company in the formulation design group for 7 years, and for the last 10 years, she has been with Vertex Pharmaceuticals Incorporated, supporting projects in formulation and process development of solid oral dosage forms, from early phases to commercialization and line extension. Eleni has a keen interest in pediatric drug development and has spent several years focusing on line extension and pediatric formulations. She and her group develop formulations for pediatric clinical trials as well as commercial pediatric products. At the end of the webinar, you will receive an email from Mahalea with a feedback survey. I'd like to say that it's very important to Eleni as well as to us as moderators to ensure the quality and value of the webinar series. So we really appreciate your feedback. And I'd also like to say that, invite you to please join us to our next webinar on April 5th, given by the EU PFI representatives on what is the EU PFI and what can we do for you. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Eleni. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and good morning, everyone. Please let me know if you cannot hear me well. It's my pleasure to take a little bit of time this morning to give you some of my thoughts on some of the formulation considerations, but more broadly, CMC considerations for pediatric drug development. As Beth mentioned, for the last several years, I've been doing pediatric drug development at Vertex Pharmaceuticals and specifically focusing on the formulation and process development. However, I guess my disclaimer is that these are my personal opinions that I'll be sharing in the next few slides. So an outline of the presentation, I'll spend a few minutes with an introduction to the topic and then share some of the thoughts around formulating around a specific pediatric disease. Then review some of the age-appropriate dosage forms, both from a market access standpoint as well as from a regulatory standpoint. And spend, I would say, probably the 2/3 of the presentation focusing on a specific dosage form, which is oral granules as a flexible dosage form. I should also clarify that Even though a lot of the thoughts that will be shared are general and apply to all different types of dosage forms, the majority of the focus of the presentation and the examples given are really around solid oral dosage forms for small molecule products. I will specifically talk about some of the processability challenges, assessing palatability and acceptability in dosing with food, and end with some conclusions. So with that, I'll just try to put a little bit of, a perspective and try to put some motivation regarding doing pediatric drug development, which I know is a mute point for this particular group, because all of you are clearly very interested in this topic, and that's why you've called into this webinar. So the reality, unfortunately, is still that even though children are a significant part of the world population, the majority of drugs prescribed to children, even in the developed world, 2/3 of the drugs in the US and half of them in the EU, as of a few years back, were still not really studied and labeled for pediatric use, but they were used off-label. That means that many times the testing was only done in adult populations, not even potentially for the same indication. And obviously that has a lot of risks, both for overdosing and exposing the children to unnecessary side effects, or underdosing and not achieving the desired efficacy for the product. And then there is the lack of appropriate dosage forms, which we'll discuss later in the presentation. Part of the reason for this is that there are, unfortunately, economic disincentives for doing pediatric research and development. Many times, these are relatively small market volume products compared to relatively high development costs, especially if a more elaborate formulation approach is desired, or you have device and formulation considerations. Many times children actually have a lot fewer chronic illnesses, and they also represent a higher proportion of the uninsured and underinsured population. And then lastly, there is unfortunately still very different needs and gaps between the pediatric population and pediatric diseases in the developed versus the developing world. And all of this leads to still struggling, and that's why, as I said, the IQ working group on focusing on pediatrics has been put together, struggling for both industry and academia and the regulators to expand the use of medicine to the pediatric populations. So regulations have been put in place, both in the US as well as in the European Union, that encourage and ensure that the sponsor companies do have specific pediatric plans in place, that they put them in place early on in their development, and they discuss them with the agency. So there is alignment on what are both the clinical plans as well as the non-clinical and CMC formulation plans for the product ahead of the effort. And that has led to a lot more pediatric products being developed and being approved in the last 10 years or so since this legislation has been enacted. However, as I said, still there is a lot of drugs that, especially older drugs, that do not have specific pediatric formulations. And another reason for that, which again, I know it's a cliche, but it's a reality, is that the population, the target population here is very difficult to handle. It's a very diverse population. It ranges from preterm neonates to 18-year-olds, which comes with all kinds of differences, developmental, physiological, and psychological, focusing specifically on drug development and formulation development. There are significant differences in absorption, distribution, and metabolism and excretion, which could impact formulation development. And then additionally, there is a low tolerance for food tasting drugs, especially in children, which are additional, complicating factors and difficulties in developing products for children. Additional formulation considerations are the age appropriateness and the safety of the product, the dose flexibility and accuracy of the product, the ability to administer and the ease to administer, especially under different settings, and the acceptability and palatability. And we will touch on all of these topics in the next few slides. Before I move on, though, I wanted to take a moment and acknowledge the fact that there are already a lot of different pediatric formulations are there that are age appropriate and have been developed with children in mind. Not only do children take products that are typically developed for adults, such as capsules and tablets, but there are chewable tablets and dispersible tablets and granule products that are developed specifically for children. There is a variety of solution and suspension products that enable dosing in children. And there is also a lot of products that are specifically designed for children. I have an example at the bottom right of a nebulizer that's designed for pediatric populations, and it's such that's also an attractive device. And one of my favorite dosage forms, which is gummy bears, which again makes the product very attractive to the children. And that's one of the considerations also, which is mentioned in a lot of the regulatory guidance, is we want something that's acceptable and palatable, but also not something that can be abused as candy. So I'll provide a few more thoughts around what does it mean to formulate for a specific pediatric disease. So we start by thinking a bit more about the patient and the disease. So we talked in the previous slide about the age range and the diversity of the population. And if you are trying to develop a product that covers, obviously, the entire range of the pediatric population, that puts some additional or different constraints. And then that comes with the acceptability of different dosage forms in different age ranges. Additionally, the impact of the disease and the interaction between the disease and the patient can guide formulation. Obviously, there is a big difference between a chronic disease and something that you'd expect a child to take, let's say, 3 times a day for many years, versus something that's going to be single dose or single use, acute use. The nature of the disease can also impact the ability of the patient to take the drug. If somebody, for example, cannot swallow and they need to be gavased if it's oral, or they need a different route of administration is a consideration, as well as the nature of the disease and how that might influence the patient and the caregiver to administer the medicine. So if it's something that's life-saving, even though it may not necessarily be the most palatable formulation, typically the caregiver and the parent might be a lot more inclined to, make sure that the patient is compliant versus something that's not quite necessarily as important. When it comes to formulation, formulation is really not done necessarily differently for pediatrics than it's done for other products. So it's always a balance between the physicochemical properties of the API, the excipients, as well as the administration of the product, and whether devices or whether, for example, food is needed for administration. And it's always targeting having a product that's stable, processable, and bioavailable. The additional, complexity with pediatric formulations is that we have to worry a lot more about the palatability and the acceptability. So by considering all of these factors, which we would for any regular product, and the additional constraints specifically for pediatric products, we'll come up with different formulations. So for example, the API physicochemical properties could be such that enable or actually negate the ability to do a certain formulation. If something is not soluble and not stable in aqueous media, a solution or a suspension formulation may not be an option. Similarly, excipient acceptability is a very different consideration, even for the same excipients for adults and children. And the pediatric working group, as well as the EU PFI, have been putting a lot of effort in educating people about the acceptability of excipients, gathering literature information, and making people aware of the fact that they need to consider the specific population and not just the fact that the excipient is acceptable for adults, for example. And then we'll talk a bit more at the back end of the presentation about administration, and specifically about administration with food. So what is the ideal pediatric formulation? And these are some thoughts that come from a 2006 European Medicine Agency reflection paper. So ideally, you want minimal dosing frequency. Having a child having to take something 3 or 4 times a day, like some of the antibiotics, for example, is challenging. Having a dosage form that fits all would be great, but that's typically not possible for various reasons. that practically means that you have to develop a range of products, maybe a range of different formulations for different age groups. And within an age group and within a formulation platform, you may still have to have multiple potencies or doses to accommodate dosing by weight or dosing by surface area, which adds to the complexity of the product compared to products that we typically develop for adults. You expect minimal impact on the lifestyle. We already talked about the acceptability of the excipients. Ideally, we want to minimize how many excipients we use, and there's even specific guidances there from regulatory agencies about avoiding unnecessary excipients such as colorants, for example, in pediatric products. Convenience and ease of handling are very important. If you open a sachet and you have a sprinkle and the sprinkle is all over the place and you can't actually collect it to dose it, or if it's very static or things like that, it makes it very difficult for the parent to administer the dose, and it makes that administration not reliable. Obviously, we also want something that's stable and elegant, and ultimately, from a commercial standpoint, it's commercially viable and cost-effective. And that's particularly important for drugs that are geared towards the developed world, where certain things like refrigeration may not be available, and this might dictate the type of products you want to develop. So with that in mind, I will spend a little bit of time reviewing what are the different types of dosage forms that are considered age appropriate in pediatric populations, and in the next slide, look at some of the products that are commercially available. So as I mentioned earlier, the age range of this population is very diverse, from preterm newborns all the way to adolescents. And as a result, even just focusing for a moment on oral administration, the types of dosage forms that are considered preferred for this population changes with age. So for the really young children, from newborns to infants and even preschool children, the general preference right now is for solution and suspension formulations. And the various powders and multiparticulars are becoming more popular. And then as children get older, solid oral dosage forms such as oral dispersible tablets, chewable tablets, and then tablets or capsules are becoming more preferable. And definitely adolescents and older school children have a preference for more conventional solid oral dosage forms that's easier to take, such as tablets and capsules. There are obviously a variety of other routes of administration: nasal, rectal, parenteral, etc. So this preference about age appropriateness does translate to products that are on the market. So in this particular survey, which I have to admit is about 10 years old now, the majority of the products that were reviewed were still solutions and suspensions. However, there is slowly a significant number of products that are becoming available that are either sprinkles in capsules or orally disintegrating or chewable tablets or powders for reconstitution. So there is definitely a change in the types of dosage forms that are available and that are considered acceptable in children. As I said, I will spend the majority of the discussion focusing specifically on oral granules as a flexible solid oral dosage form based on some of the work we have been doing here in the last few years. I just mentioned that there are several marketed products that are commercially available. Under the term granules, I'm actually using the term granules to describe a variety of products. Technically, for those of you who are formulators, it could be granules, it could be multiparticulates, it could be pellets, it could be beads, could be mini tablets, sprinkles, all of those together. I will use the word granules at this point, from this point on in the presentation. There are some dimension considerations. So there is an FDA guidance that says that the maximum particle size of 2.5 millimeters is a requirement for products that will be labeled as a sprinkle. And there is also a World Health Organization technical report that states that the mini tablet size should be less than 4 millimeters. What you see on the picture on the right there is, on the left is a mini tablet product. and on the right is a granulated product, both of which are prepared for sprinkle administration. Some of the advantages of this dosage form is that they can be more stable than solution and suspensions, and they may not require the stabilizers or refrigeration that may be required for solution and suspensions, especially for aqueous solutions and suspensions. The products can be taste neutral, either by manipulating the formulation or by coating the product. You can typically administer relatively small volumes or small masses, obviously depends on the drug load, but compared to liquids, and they can enable dosing a broad range of populations, so ages or doses. However, for really young children, it's probably still necessary to dose in some sort of medium, such as a food or a liquid. There are literature studies especially in the last 5 years, that have started to indicate the acceptability of multiparticulates in really young children by themselves as a product, not necessarily administered in food. And I think this is a very interesting area of research as this evolves, to see how low can we dose this type of dosage form without necessarily the need for food. I'll spend a few minutes talking about some of the manufacturing considerations for these granule formulations. As I mentioned, because the granule formulations title covers a variety of products, there are obviously many different ways to make them. Typically, these products are granulated by some sort of granulation approach, such as wet or dry granulation, fluid bed granulation with booster column coating, which is one of the common ways to apply coatings and barrier membranes on the products, as well as extrusion spheronization. Direct compression using multi-tip tooling is another way to generate a granule product, and I will give an example of that in the next slide. And also, we have shared in this seminar series, I think in the previous seminar by Matt Santangelo from Pfizer, about their approach to use melt spray congealed microspheres, and I would recommend people watch that seminar if they haven't watched it live. It's a very interesting presentation. For all of this, there are various degrees of particle size control, which can impact the performance of the product in vitro and in vivo, as well as the ability to move to the next processing steps, such as the coating and the packaging. So there might be a need for these products to be coated. Typically, this might be done for taste masking or for other purposes, such as release modification. So, for example, there are several products which are enteric coated, such as enzymes that are given for a pancreatic deficiency. There might be ways to control the release by changing the polymer and using either pH-triggered release, such as reverse enteric coatings, or pH-neutral release, which typically is delayed release. And with all of these approaches, we have to consider the impact to the bioavailability of the product. So the product may or may not need coating, but it will definitely need packaging. And there are different ways to package and present the product to the patient. Bulk packaging can be accommodated as long as it's given with some sort of measuring device. But the majority of the products that have been commercialized recently, at least, are individual unit dosage forms, and the multiparticulates are either packaged in capsules or in sachets and stick packs. This way, the patient has to, or the caregiver just has to open the capsule or open the sachet, take all of the content of that, and administer it per the label without having to necessarily measure out of a bulk bottle. There is also a lot of interesting work in development of new dispensing devices, and again, I recommend, that's where I have the reference at the bottom, that people go and look at Matt's seminar from November. For all of these packaging approaches, we have to make sure that we have dosing accuracy. If you are using a capsule or a sachet, we need to ensure that we can recover the product accurately from the packaging component, and we need to worry about days of handling. So as an example of an oral granule, I'll talk a little bit about the product that we have developed. It's the Kalydeco Ivacaftor oral granule for patients that are less than 6 years old. So this is a product for patients that have cystic fibrosis. So the formulation is a blend that is compressed into mini tablets to form the granule. We start by formulating it appropriately so that the palatability is acceptable by adding appropriate fillers and sweeteners to the blend formulation. And then, as I said, we compress to small mini tablets of approximately 2 millimeters in size, which are age appropriate in order to minimize choking hazards. These mini tablets are then packaged by count into different sachets or packages in order to get different strengths of the product, which enables dosing different age and weight ranges. Once the patient has received their stick pack, their packets, they would open the packets, mix it with a small amount, approximately 5 milliliters of a soft food or a liquid per the instructions in the insert, and then given a small amount of time to disperse the product and administer it with the food. And this approach has enabled dosing kids from 6 years old, and we're now trying to go down to actually very, very young children. So some of the unique challenges for pediatric formulations, and more specifically, I will talk about oral granules, are processability, palatability, and acceptability, and administration with food. Which typically some of these considerations we don't encounter necessarily with more conventional solid oral dosage forms for adult populations. So for the processability challenges for mini tabs, I mean, the reason this is a challenge is not because this is a pediatric product, but because of the size. As you see on the picture on the top left, you can, for those who may not be familiar with tablet tooling, you see conventional tablet tooling versus mini-tab, multi-tip tablet tooling, and you can immediately see that there is a big difference in the surface to volume ratio. There is a majority of the product now is actually not on the inside of the tablet, but actually on the outside of the tablet in the surface. That can cause significant issues with things like ejection forces and breakouts. So a lot of process optimization that needs to go into the compression process, as well as the characterization and optimization of the material properties. For example, the flow properties of the formulation in order to be able to fill these small dies appropriately to get good weight control for the product. Assessing the mechanical properties is another challenge, and fine-tuning it, even measuring the hardness or the tensile strength of a small compact and measuring it without much variability is a challenge, and then manipulating the mechanical properties so you have the right balance of compactability and tabletability versus friability at these size ranges is also a challenge. Another example of some of the things we had to address is low assay and material losses. So when you start compressing and you start using the product in the beginning of the run, what we saw initially, and you can see the graph at the top right, focusing on the maroon curve that says single tip, it would take actually up to potentially 30 minutes of compression to get to the point that we would have appropriate assay for some of these products. And we would have to find ways to obviously mitigate this either by using multiple tip tooling or by granulating so that you can enable getting to the right assay of the product from the beginning of the processing run. Similarly, content uniformity at this small scale, a 2 millimeter mini tab might be anywhere from, I don't know, a few milligrams, less than 10 milligrams definitely in weight, can be a challenge. And ultimately, you have to balance all of these processability concerns with bioavailability and making sure you have a product, obviously, that performs and many times performs similarly to the adult product if it's a pediatric line extension activity. So changing gears a little bit, we will talk in the next few slides about palatability, acceptability, and compliance. We all know, especially those of us who are parents, but even from personal experience, how hard it is to dose a child with medicine. And they might take it once, but if they don't like it, the ability of being able to administer the same formulation twice is very, very low. So palatability clearly matters from a compliance standpoint. When we talk about palatability, we actually talk about a lot of different things. So there's sensory attributes that describe the product. Those are the more conventional things that people think of as far as taste is concerned. So gustatory attributes, things like sweetness, bitterness, sourness. But there is also olfactory attributes, smell, that can make a big difference in how acceptable and palatable the product is, and texture and appearance. Things like chalkiness, oily texture, etc. Palatability and acceptability is influenced by genetics. So there are people who by nature are very sensitive and can sense things and assess different taste attributes much more so than others. And it's also a function of age. Also, preferences are a function of age. So kids definitely prefer sweeter products. Adults may have a lot more tolerance and acceptability or palatability for bitter products, such as, for example, coffee or bitter chocolate. There is also a cultural preferences element to what might be considered palatable. So, for example, kids in Mexico and India may be more willing to eat something that's spicy compared to kids in other parts of the world. So there's all these elements, the stimulus from the product, the sensation, as well as the perception that leads to a response, which is ultimately what we're trying to assure is acceptable, and that leads to the patient taking the medication. So how would you measure palatability? There are different ways to do palatability evaluations. One way is to use adult expert panelists. This is an example on the left of a flavor profile method where adult trained expert panelists take a product, assess it for different attributes. Basically, it's typically a masticate and expectorate approach, and then monitor that particular attribute as a function of time. As you can see in this particular example, this product starts off as bitter, and the bitterness reduces as a function of time, but it also has some other attributes such as an aromatic solvent smell and an oily mouthfeel. So adult expert panels, as well as adult panels that might not be expert, but basically phase 1 consumer type studies can be done to assess the acceptability of a product. However, many times, ultimately, we need data in children because they are the target population. So in those cases, many times, other methodologies, such as the facial hedonic scale that you can see on the right side of the slide, are used. So as part of clinical studies, the patient, if it's old enough, and the caregiver can assess qualitatively the palatability of the product by assessing how bad, neutral, or good it might taste. There are also other ways to assess palatability. There is in vitro assessments. There's even some animal models, which I haven't actually put on the slide. But my personal experience, there's a lot of limitations with these approaches. As the technology evolves, I think potentiometric sensors may become a bigger part of our toolkit, but there are a lot of limitations about needing, for example, a solution for the analysis. So if you have a granule product, you won't be able to assess the texture elements of the palatability, and then there's the time element and the aftertaste, which again is hard to assess in vitro. So you do have palatability challenges. There are different ways to overcome them by taste masking, and I'm just going to mention this. I'm not going to get into this in detail. There is a lot of literature out there about how do you taste mask or enhance the taste. One approach that can be very effective is the modification of the API by changing form or going to a prodrug or changing the solubility. You can actually definitely impact the palatability of the product. Going to a form that's less soluble will enhance the palatability, but the reality is that for a lot of these products, once you do a pediatric development, the API and the form of the API is typically defined, and you have to work with what's typically used for the adult product unless that's absolutely not acceptable. So if you do have an API that has a challenge, then there are other ways to mitigate it, such as complexation and encapsulation using cyclodextrins and ion exchange resins, or using barrier coatings like reverse enteric coatings that we discussed earlier. Then there is the use of excipients that help not necessarily improve the taste attributes of the API itself, but improve the sensory attributes of the product altogether, things like sweeteners and flavors and viscosity modifiers for solutions, etc. And then there is an impact of how the product is administered, so the palatability is affected by dosing in food. And as a last resort, which is something that I think a lot of parents do, there is the additional motivation of a chaser. So this might be trying to bribe a child to take the drug because they'll take a piece of candy or chocolate afterwards. All of these approaches do impact the bioavailability and potentially the stability and the compatibility of the product. So they need to be considered, and they can impact the dosing accuracy of the product. So we talked a bit about palatability, but what is acceptability, and how do the two of them come together? So acceptability is a lot more complicated than palatability, and is the ability and willingness of the patient and the caregiver to administer the medicine. Taste and palatability are a significant part of this, but it's a much more complex concept that includes the texture and the smell and the appearance, the ability to swallow. So there is a lot of research, as I mentioned, in how small a solid oral dosage form can a child swallow without choking, can a child swallow a tablet, and at what age can a child swallow a tablet, etc. If it's a liquid, how much can you dose, how much volume can somebody drink, especially in one increment, the impact of the disease, the use of devices, if you have to handle, considering all the human factors, and then food. And ultimately, it is preferred to have data from the actual target pediatric population, and I think that's something that is being encouraged also by regulatory agencies. I want to clarify that ability does not equal willingness, and willingness does not equal compliance. So there might be situations where the child is able to take the product, but might still not be willing, or in other situations where the product may not be the most palatable, but for other reasons that might have to do with the disease or the nature of the disease, the compliance might still be high, which makes, again, this a little bit more complicated. And the last point I wanted to make, and I think one of the most important points, is that there is really no standardized methodology or tools for assessing acceptability. And that has an impact in the nature of the data that are available to, to use for benchmarking purposes. And there are several efforts. I've highlighted one effort that the IQ Pediatric Working Group is participating in. That's the World Health Organization Research Toolkit for Pediatric Drug and Formulation Development. This draft has a module specifically focusing on acceptability. I think there's a lot more awareness that this is a big gap in pediatric drug development. And several of us, I know, in this working group are working with others in the EUPFI to try to help develop some of these standardized tools for acceptability assessment. Can you connect the two? How do you connect palatability and acceptability? So this is an example on the left of some palatability assessments. In particular, what you see is the bitterness intensity of a product. The black line there is the active ingredient. The blue line is the formulated product. As you can see, just by formulating it appropriately, we're able to reduce both the amplitude as well as the time period for which you can perceive certain bitterness intensity for the product. And then when the product is dosed in small amount of food media as a vehicle, specifically in this case baby formula and applesauce, the bitterness intensity is further reduced. How does this palatability then correlate to acceptability? So as part of clinical trials, who can collect data, and this is actually a hypothetical example of how many kids or how many patients liked or disliked the product, and correlate that to the data we get from palatability assessments, either in vitro or with panelists. I think it's really important to consider, as I said, the impact of the dosing vehicle, and I'll have another example of that, as well as the impact of the dose, because for exactly the same formulation, going up in dose, you can definitely see a difference in the acceptability of the product. So dosing with food. In general, the formulation should be such that you're not relying on the food to enhance or to make it palatable and acceptable. However, it is a reality that for really young kids, you may have to mix or disperse in small amount of soft food or liquids to administer, because there's still a lot of debate on how young a child can actually swallow, let's say, a granular, a multiparticular, or a mini dab without food. So if the approach is to use food, then there is a lot of considerations about what foods to use, considering whether they're not available. That has proven to be a difficulty in doing clinical trials and considering the commercial use of products across different geographical locations, as well as cultural preferences for certain foods. For example, applesauce might be very available in the US, may not be as available in other parts of the world. There's obviously concerns about allergic reactions. Peanut butter might be a great vehicle to mask bitterness, but it may not be appropriate to administer. The complexity of the food can influence the taste of the product. So as you see on the right-hand side, there is a graph of bitterness intensity of a product, which is the black, and then the bitterness intensity of the product dosed with water, as well as with different small amounts, the same small amount of food, and the results are very different. Materials or food or fluids that are not very complex in flavor may not be as able to assist with the palatability of the product, while things that are potentially more viscous and more complex in flavor, such as in this particular case, for example, chocolate pudding and strawberry preserve, might do a better job with respect to bitterness. If the approach is to dose with food, then there is a lot more CMC effort that's required around the instructions for how to handle both the product and the food and how to do the administration. What food? How do you measure the amount of food? Do you provide additional devices for the parents, for example, to measure the amount of food? Do you mix or do you not mix? There are products, for example, with enteric coatings where you don't want to mix and dissolve the coating before the food is, with the drug is administered. And then how long and under what conditions, ambient refrigeration, do you need to mix and keep and dose the product? So the inducibility and compatibility is a big difference compared to other products. And also you need to consider the impact of pharmacokinetics. Would it be possible that once the product is mixed with some amount of food versus dosing it alone, there is a difference. So the compatibility with foods is a significant challenge because you may have a lot of effort that needs to be devoted for analytical methods. Obviously, the ability to look at, let's say, small level degradants of products in a matrix of applesauce or Nutella is challenging. And there are also concerns about the stability in the food media. So obviously, if you have a pH-sensitive product, then potentially dosing with various juices or aqueous media may be problematic. Additionally, apart from chemical stability, physical stability, especially for solid products like oral granules, can be a significant concern. So you can have either the crystallization of new forms or either the formation of new forms, or if you start with an amorphous product, you could have crystallization of that product in the food media. So I have an example here of one particular product which, when mixed with food that contained triglycerides, actually formed several new crystalline forms with the triglycerides. And at that point, you have to assess how do you risk assess the potential impact of those new forms in the performance of the product. So what you see on the right there is some kinetic solubility data in simulated intestinal fluid. The red curve is the amorphous API. The green curve is the amorphous dispersion of that API. And then you see three different complex forms that formed with triglycerides. And what you can see is that we were able to assess that the solubility and the stability of these materials were such that it would not impact the performance of the product in vivo. So in conclusion, I want to remind people again that it's critical to think about the specifics of the disease and the patient when you decide about the pediatric formulation and what is acceptable generally in this population may be different for the specific disease. So for example, the average 6-year-old may not be able to swallow a tablet, but a 6-year-old that has a chronic disease and has been on medication since it was an infant may be very able to actually take a tablet at this age. The pediatric formulations, like all formulations, ultimately fulfill multiple requirements. It's a balancing act, but there are additional requirements such as the palatability and the compatibility with foods. And it's really important to assess those elements early in development. And ultimately, I want to acknowledge the fact that there's still a lot of gaps when it comes to the science and our understanding of how to assess a lot of these elements that are unique to pediatrics, such as the acceptability. And there's a big need for collaborations between industry, academia, regulators in order to advance our toolkit. And I want to acknowledge some of the specific collaborations that are ongoing, such as the IQ Pediatric Working Group that's organizing this webinar, the European Pediatric Formulation Initiative that is collaborating with IQ, and they'll be presenting actually their next webinar, as well as the United States Pediatric Formulation Initiative. With that, I guess I want to end by saying that we all need to focus on doing pediatric drug development because kids, like adults, need to benefit from the advances made in medicine. And acknowledge the IQ Pediatric Working Group for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, as well as a lot of people who over the last several years here at Vertex worked on developing several pediatric products. I think with that, that's my last slide. Halil, back to you.
Thanks very much, Eleni. I'm going to turn things over now to our moderator, Beth Galila, who's going to open up the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Mahalea, and thank you very much, Eleni, for presenting today. It was a very informative and interesting presentation. I don't see questions. If anyone has any questions, I just saw one come up, but I have a question here from David Tan from AbbVie, my co-leader for Pediatric Working Group. Since no granulation was conducted for Kalydeco, do we need to control the particle size of the API?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Since no granulation was used for am I saying it right? Kalydeco?
Yes.
Did you need to control the particle size of the API?
I would say that the considerations there are similar to any, direct compression formulation, controlling the API particle size such that, the flow of the blend is acceptable in order to proceed to compaction. Admittedly, as I mentioned, when you have to deal with really small dyes, that can be a particular challenge.
Okay. And one other related question. Kalydeco also has an adult tablet, which is used for patients older than 6 years old. So how did you derive at 6 years old for the age cutoff for that formulation?
I'm not sure I am the best person. Sorry, there's a little bit of noise in the background. I'm not sure I'm the best person to speak to some of the earlier development for the adult tablet. I think some of it comes with clinical data and other elements that drive the decisions for the dose, and the acceptability was assessed as part of the clinical trial.
Okay, thanks. Okay, there's a question from Asha Rajapakshi. I would like to hear Eleni's thoughts around batch release strategy especially for mini tablet products when there is a lot dose flexibility or small batch size.
That is a great question. And I think there are different strategies that can be used. One could consider whether you are releasing the bulk granule product and then packaging and then doing some different type or reduced type of testing, if you will, for the finished product, or whether you're going to proceed to doing the release testing on the finished product, assuming that's like an encapsulated or a packaged product somehow. So there are different strategies that can be employed in order to allow for flexibility in preparing multiple dosage strengths.
Okay, great.
I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Okay, thank you. One more question from Mike B. Do you know what the youngest age can swallow? In your opinion, I guess, what is the youngest age that can swallow mini tablets?
So the way we have been administering mini tablets, they are not swallowed as a whole. There is literature out there, and there's active studies from participating at the AAPS workshop and hot topics discussion with a lot of the people actually who are on the phone. There are studies that are trying to dose even infants, and by infants I mean less than 24-month-olds with multiparticulars or granules or mini tabs directly. And there is some evidence that there is acceptability. However, I guess the examples I have given are all examples where the product is dispersed in a small amount of food or liquid.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Max Lee. Are there agency expectations to include stability in select foods if these are recommended or specified in the label? And how could this data be generated?
I'm trying to figure out. Yes, I think there are expectations. So if you don't have the data, you have to justify where you don't need the data. But the in-use stability of the product, so the stability of the product in the foods that you are administering in, and for the time period that you are proposing as acceptable for the parent or the caregiver to administer the product, need to be justified.
Okay, yes, and the data is generated through in-use studies. Right?
Yeah, so the data is generated through stability studies as part of your, marketing application. And as I said, there is a lot of challenges, analytical challenges in developing, depending obviously on what are the considerations or the concerns for the specific molecule, degradation-wise, either physical or chemical, in developing the appropriate, HPLC methods or X-ray methods, to be able to look at the physical and chemical stability in a food matrix.
I actually have a question related to that. So when the in-use studies are performed, use time studies in food, do you know if there are how much validation is done for tests such as dissolution, potency, accuracy for those stability studies in food?
So I'm not, I guess my disclaimer is I'm not an analytical person, so I cannot speak to that directly, but the methods need to be appropriate for use. So a certain amount of method qualification is needed in order to ensure that the methods are appropriate for use. That may be different than what you'd need, for commercial release methods.
Right, okay. If you don't have the details, that's fine. Okay, I have a question from Murali Vupala. Have you seen any differences in the bioavailability when dosed in different foods? And do we need to take this into consideration?
I think it's possible to see differences in the bioavailability, and assuming that the volume of food that is given is really small, it's not necessarily a food effect. So if you were giving a large volume of food, especially in a relatively young child, and if the food is very fatty, then you could have a more conventional food effect. What I'm describing is a small volume of food where the amount of, for example, fat is not what's causing the bioavailability difference, but it could be actually changes, for example, in stability or form changes or other things that could lead to a bioavailability difference. So that's something that needs to be assessed,
Right.
at least in vitro, if not in vivo.
Right, right. Okay. Thank you, Eleni. I think that's all the questions that we have. I really appreciate, again, you presenting today and answering questions. And I think if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to forward them to Mahalea, and Mahalea will have your questions forwarded over to Eleni. I'll turn it back over to Mahalea if there's no further questions.
We had one more question that I'll go ahead and read aloud. Are you aware of food effect studies for pediatric formulations? Are there specific foods that actually used in doing the food effect studies, and are the studies done in adults or pediatrics, knowing well the differences in physiology?
So I'm not aware of any specific guidances around food effect studies for pediatric populations. Again, these are some personal thoughts. If the drug is intended to be dosed with food or not to be dosed with food because of food effect in the adult population, I think that's something that needs to be considered and potentially evaluated in the pediatric population as well. If there are no constraints in administration with food in adult population, and you are not dosing with food as a vehicle, the team would need to decide on what the potential risk is and if there is a need for additional food effect studies. However, for products who are already for adults prescribed with food, most likely there'll be, if there is a food effect for other reasons, not for bioavailability reasons, most likely that will carry to the label for the pediatric product.
Okay, thank you. Again, I don't think we have any further questions. I'd like to thank Eleni and Beth and David for presenting this webinar this morning. A reminder to those of you who are still on the phone, we do have another webinar scheduled for April with the EU PFI, and that registration link is available on the IQ website, and it'll also be available to the IQ group on IQ LinkedIn page. We will be sending out a feedback survey at the conclusion of this webinar, so please help us continue to provide value through these webinars and send us your feedback on this webinar. And if you would like to access the recording, that also will be available on the IQ website. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Eleni. Thank you, Beth and David. Hope you all have a great weekend.